We're very pleased to have Jim Wilson with us as part of our interview process today. Thank you for joining us, Jim.
Thank you for having me.
As we start off every interview with background questions for context, I'm going to start out by asking you where your parents were born.
Both mother and father were born in England. My mother of Irish background. The parents came from Ireland, but both were born in England, as I was. I was born there too.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
And where did you receive your education? Elementary, secondary, any post-secondary?
I received my elementary, my high school, and my post-secondary education in England. I left England to come to Canada, and I took my master's degree at McGill. But my early qualifications prior to my master's degree were all taken in England. Yeah.
Very good. And Jim, what was your occupation?
I was a teacher. Yes. Okay. And well, for most of the time, but then for the past, for quite a number of years, towards the end of that, I moved into a slightly different career. I was the president of the Teachers Union.
Okay, very good. Yeah. And where do you live now?
I live in NDG.
Ah, we're neighbors. We'll talk.
I don't know.
We'll talk about that later.
Based on your background, it looks like in a more, shall we say, sunny spot than I am. Or is that a picture?
Yeah, and we'll talk about that later as well.
Okay.
So
okay.
we're gonna jump right into the meat of the matter, as I like to call it. These are questions concerning your experience living in Quebec today. And we'll start off by asking you, what is the best thing in your experience about living in Quebec?
It's part of Canada. Okay. And arguably part of the North American society. That's the best part about living in Quebec.
Okay. Now, the next question, I'm going to preface it by telling you, a lot of people have trouble with it. And certainly if I was asked this question, I would have trouble with it, but I'm going to ask you to respond to the question as it is, and then elaborate on your answer in any way you see fit. Having said that, describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
Frustrated. That's how I would describe it.
Okay. And where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
I'm very comfortable with English speakers, obviously. And also I do have a lot of, shall we, social connections with former colleagues, teachers. And I also feel quite comfortable at the local YMCA, that kind of stuff, where I like to work out. I didn't for a time because of COVID, but I'll in an hour or two, I'll go for a swim. I like to keep in reasonable good condition and such like, but that's about it. Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm going to preface the next question because it's a two-part question, and people have asked me about the second part. They say, well, Dave, what do you mean by the official definition in Quebec? And what we mean is simply your perception of what the official definition is. It could be based on what the Quebec government says, what the Canadian government says, what you see in the media, what your friends say. So having said that, it's your perception of the official definition in Quebec. So I'll just go ahead and ask you the two-part question. Right. How would you define a Quebecer? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
My definition of Quebec would be somebody who lives, works, pays taxes, probably has a family and maybe a property in Quebec. That would make me a Quebecer. Yes, that would be my idea of what a Quebecer is. Yes.
Okay.
And what would be the other part you said?
Yeah. Do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
Well, if you think of it as what I've described, then I would include my part as being that. But then I have talked about it more in rather almost statistical terms rather than ones which are in any way connected to, shall we say, emotion. I don't have any of that. If that were the case, then I would have a great difficulty in saying I'm a Quebecer. Yeah. Yeah.
Now, has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
Yes, I think it's changed insofar as that over the years, I've become, shall we say, more and more distant from the process of what Quebec is as a society. It's become, this society of Quebec has become a lot more self-absorbed. Oh, just excuse me, I'll just have to do. Sorry about that. That was
Okay.
before I just cut it off. Yes, go on. I'm sorry. What was that?
The question was, has your sense of identity as a
Yeah,
Quebecer?
yeah. I think I've become slightly more, shall we say, distant from the mainstream, which seems to focus so much on language and culture, French language and culture, to the extent if you're not a Francophone, then in some way, you're not really a true Quebecer. They have this idea of Quebec being very much connected with French speaking and arguably whatever you want to use with culture. And I don't really feel I want to be part of that. And in some ways, I think the entire political process is rigged anyway to largely exclude people who are not French speaking, and the island of Montreal in particular. I think the electoral system here, and I sort of wrote a little bit of a paper on it, and went to the sort of there was a process by which you could make a presentation to the electoral. Went there, and it's very clear that when you look at Quebec in terms of the electoral system, then one French speaker in the provinces, and I'll use that word in a way that outside the Montreal metropolitan area, their vote is worth almost 3 or 4 times as much as somebody who lives in Montreal, which distorts the value of the vote. And I don't see any party right now would be prepared to address that as a serious problem. So really, as a person who lives on the island of Montreal, speaks English, but speaking English is less of the problem. It's then I don't have the same input into the democratic process as somebody who lives in a more rural part of Quebec. And that translates itself into the actions made by governments who are so anxious to retain power that the people who have more power can exercise it in a way which is, I think, discriminatory. Yeah.
Okay, and what are, leading into that is the next question. What are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec today?
Well, I think I've just described one, is that the frustration, a feeling almost powerlessness, and particularly I find it very hard to find a political party that would in any way represent my feelings, at least a political party with power. It's one thing to have a political party. There was some years ago, the idea of the Equality Party, I think, touched on the way that I felt. I'd like to have my voice heard, but I don't think any political party right now that's got any representation, even locally, let alone provincially, that has power. Federally, I consider that the federal parties have been so subservient to the Quebec politicians because of their concern about being elected and getting the Francophone vote. I think they have been prepared to ignore the minority English in Quebec because it doesn't suit their electoral sort of wish to be elected. That's. I hope I haven't said too much there.
Now, in recent years, some members of Quebec's Francophone majority have identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support, and which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
Well, I think that I do find it extremely annoying. In fact, to be honest with you, hypocritical of the Quebec people who talk about they are to be defended and we have to be looked after. And there seem to be, and I consider hypocrisy, wanting for yourself what you're not prepared to give to others. And the French minority in Canada demands rights and protection, which is understandable. I'm not disputing that, but they're not prepared to, shall we say, exercise those rights to a minority in their own province. So I find hypocrisy runs very clearly through the process in the electoral system, in the governing part of Canada, of Quebec. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I
And,
think I'm trying to make it as clear as I can.
and you're doing fine, Jim. What is the biggest problem facing Quebec, and how, in your mind, could it be resolved?
The biggest problem facing Quebec, and I've done a little bit of studying about this. It started to happen in the 1950s, 60s, when the birth rate of Quebec went from what was then one of the highest birth rates in the Western world to today one of the lowest. As a consequence, you've got a demographic shift, which meant that we have a growing older population proportional to its total, and which means that you've got a large population getting older being supported by a minority which is getting smaller. And that is a serious problem which is not being tackled because of this terror they have of somebody coming from outside the country as an immigrant. And yet it's the immigration of people into Quebec that is going to be arguably their salvation. Purely from an economic standpoint, I don't see how you can maintain a standard of living which would be supported entirely by Quebec. If I may use as not a good example, but an example recently where when Britain pulled out of the European community, one of the principal issues that they raised was that the idea of they wanted to become sort of more independent, and they didn't particularly like all these immigrants coming in from Europe. And we see what's happened. Britain's gone downhill ever since. And Quebec will continue to struggle because it does not replace or, in fact, inject new workers and industries into Quebec, because why would people come here when they find A, the taxes are higher, B, the job opportunities are less, and arguably, in some cases, the salaries don't match with what is offered in other provinces. So this is not a particularly bright picture. And I see those as big issues. So I think the first thing that they would have to admit that's the governing classes would have to admit they have a problem, because their rejection of new people coming in who might be purely francophone. I mean, when you've got that, you're running into a wall, which is all this, well, we can't say that because the French language and the French culture is being endangered. Well, I'm sorry, that's got really, I didn't cause it. It's when my wife's family, I mean, they go back to prior to the conquest, if you can call it that. All it wasn't a conquest, it was a cession, but that's another story, another day. I mean, her mother was one of 11 children. That's not happening anymore. So what was able to maintain the sense of importance of the French language didn't have to be by legislation. It was done by sheer numbers, and those numbers are dwindling. And I mean, when you have a replacement rate of, you need to have each woman with more than 2 children to maintain the status. You're not getting that. Where are the people's going to come from? So I mean, this is a serious problem, and it's been, I wouldn't say it's been ignored, but at the same time, it's been sort of suppressed in a way that we don't want to talk about that too much. Yeah, yeah.
And now, before I ask the next question, I'm just going to pause for a second and ask you, have you had an opportunity to see the documentary What We Choose to Remember by Guy Rogers?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I will send you a link to that.
Okay, thank you.
after that. And the reason I asked that question is, it is a fantastic, if you're an English speaker from any background in Quebec at the moment, it's a great, or Francophone for that matter, it doesn't really matter. If you're a Quebecer, it's a great documentary to see how Quebec has honestly evolved over the last several hundred years to be where we're at today and what contributed to that.
Okay.
The subtitle to the documentary, it's What We Choose to Remember, Quebec Through Waves of Immigration.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm going to send you a link to that. The link will open up and you'll be able to watch it on your computer.
Excellent.
If your TV happens to be hooked up to the internet, you can do it on your TV, whatever you choose to do it on.
Yeah.
But I'll send you the link after that.
Thank
Now,
you.
the reason
Thank
I brought all of that up is because in the documentary, and by the way, that the director of that and writer of that documentary is a good friend of mine, and he also had some input into these questions. He used very effectively a visual tool, which I'm going to use right now with his permission, which is a show of fingers. So I'd like you to indicate by a show of fingers from a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the weakest, 10 being the strongest, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges? Jim, if you could pull your hands back, and just because of the way, yeah, okay, very good.
One hand.
Beautiful, excellent job. All right. So before we finish up, I just want to ask you if you've got anything else to say about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec today.
Yes, I do. I think it would be unfair not to sort of take note of some of the things in Quebec that I found to be very valuable. And I'll use a simple example. My daughter went to McGill and she studied dentistry at McGill. And the wonderful thing about it was that it was so, comparatively speaking, inexpensive. I mean, my family in England and people across North America, and my daughter was telling me when she was at McGill, the price of going to a Quebec university was remarkably low. So I have to make that point because it is an outstanding feature of Quebec. I would also say I'm very pleased to see a CEGEP system, which somewhat akin to Britain, where you go from 5th form and then you have something called a 6th form. And that CEGEP system affords a student who is graduating from a high school to go to a 2-year program, arguably, that gives them a cushion between high school and into that tertiary level of university. And I think that's a great idea. I'm not too happy, of course, what Quebec did last year with the linguistic components, because frankly, it goes back to my point in a way about hypocrisy, is that I really strongly believe that parents should choose what's best for their children. And it's oddly enough, and this is ridiculous, it sounds, I know, but the people who are most badly affected by the linguistic laws are arguably Francophones in Quebec. Because as an Anglophone, and because I'd been educated in England, my daughter had the right to go to English schools. Not that that was a big problem, because my wife's a Francophone, language wasn't the big issue, was that it was English people have rights to choose and Francophones don't have the right to choose. And I find that to be, it's remarkably sort of obtuse to suggest I'm going to protect you by removing a right. So that would be something that I find to be odd. So I think that would sort of cover my views about education, which after all is crucial to any society. I know that the medical system here is under scrutiny, but in fairness, I've not noticed any problem. The times my daughters, my wife and myself have had any medical issues, they've been handled beautifully, you know, so we've never, but then that was a personal experience. I'm not trying to, shall we say, expand that personal experience into society as a whole. From what I gather, it isn't that great, but I don't want to be too critical there either. I don't want to be seen coming over everything in Quebec's bad, you know, because it isn't. You know? Some things I don't like, and other things I think are fine. Yeah.
That's great, Jim. Listen, thank you very much for all your input. I'm going to
Yeah.
turn off the recording now, and then we can have a little chat
Yeah.
offline. Don't mind.